I'd always hoped Arab Jews who had lived in the Arab world, who spoke Arabic, would serve as a bridge between Israel and its neighbors. But that hasn't happened. The Arab Jews were marginalized in Israel. The elite was always an Ashkenazi elite, and the policies have been very nationalist policies of mobilizing society against the enemy.
How do you keep your identity alive when your own country tells you to forget it? When the State of Israel was created, more than 260,000 Jews migrated to it from the Arab world. Half of them were from Iraq. In fact, before 1950, a third of all Baghdad's residents were Jewish. For thousands of years, Jews have been an integral part of the Arab world, and the Mesopotamian region in particular, thriving and contributing to the culture, history, and economy of the region. So what happened in 1950 that forced the majority of them to leave their lives and their country behind? Welcome to The Big Picture, a show about the past, the present, and the future. My name is Muhammad Hassan, and today we sit down with Israeli-British historian, Professor Avi Shlaim. A former Oxford professor in international relations and a current emeritus fellow, Professor Shlaim is one of the most prominent and important historians of Israel. But when he was just 5 years old, he was one of 120,000 Iraqi Jews who packed up their life in Baghdad and moved to the newly established Jewish state. In his memoir, Three Worlds, he describes a flourishing Arab Jewish community, one many didn't want to leave, and critiques the Zionist ideology many didn't believe in. Instead, he laments the loss of his own identity, one rejected by both Iraq and Israel, but one that could hold the key to resolving the bitter conflict in the Middle East. Professor Avi Shlaim, it's a pleasure to have you. Welcome to The Big Picture. Thank you for being with us today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I am really honored to be able to talk to you about this book, this memoir that you have written about your life, about the memories of your childhood, the memories of your parents growing up in Iraq and migrating to Israel in 1950. You have written a lot about Israel, about the experience of Israelis, of Arabs, of the region. What began this journey for you to start talking and revisiting your own experience?
I'm a diplomatic historian. That's my trade. I've been a university teacher for 53 years. And I've also written a biography of King Hussein of Jordan. And I found it very easy to write that biography because I had one central character and everything revolves around the central character, and I had a chronology, so I traced the life of King Hussein phase by phase. But I had great inhibitions about writing about myself, and my friends urged me to write an autobiography. I was reluctant because I didn't think I was important enough to merit an autobiography. And my friend said, but you lived in interesting times. And indeed, I lived in interesting times. I lived in Iraq in the late 1940s. I lived when the State of Israel was established in 1948. Then I lived through the Arab-Israeli conflict following the war of 1948. So there is no question that I lived in interesting times. The problem was how to go about it, and eventually I found a solution to the problem. I read a book by Orit Bashkin. She's an Israeli Middle East expert and now a professor of history at Chicago University, and she wrote a wonderful book called New Babylonians, A History of the Jews in Modern Iraq. I learned a lot from her book about the Jews in Iraq, and reading that book gave me the prompt to write my own book, and the idea was to fit my personal story and family story to tell it against the wider canvas of the history of the Jews in Iraq. And this is what I try to do in this book. The first half is history, and the second half is autobiography, and I like to think about it as an impersonal autobiography.
And I think you mentioned in your intro that this is going to be sort of a memoir told through the lens of a historian, and very much, this it reads like a lived history of such a key and crucial time in the region, but told from the personal lens and the experiences of your family. How do you go about defining the identity, which is very much at the heart of this book, of an Arab Jew?
So the identity of the Arab Jew is a pivotal concept in this entire book. And it's very easy to define an Arab Jew. It's a Jew who lived in an Arab country. So I am an Arab Jew because I lived in Iraq up to the age of 5. But an Israeli whose parents lived in Iraq, an Iraqi who was born in Israel, his parents would be Arab Jews, but he wouldn't be, or she wouldn't be an Arab Jew. So to meet the criterion to be an Arab Jew, you have to have lived in an Arab country. And sadly, today there are very, very few Arab Jews. In Iraq, where in 1950 there were 135,000 Jews, today in Iraq there are either 3 or 4. But the concept of an Arab Jew is very contentious. Israelis really, really don't like it. In Israel, this is a very controversial notion, the notion of an Arab Jew, because everything is binary. Arab, Israeli, Jewish, Muslim, Hebrew, Arabic. And I try to get away from these binaries. But also, it's for me to define my own identity, not for other people. And I was born in Baghdad in 1945 to a Jewish family. We were Arab Jews. We spoke Arabic at home. Our culture was Arab culture. Our friends were Arab friends. There wasn't a real problem about being Jewish in Iraq. Muslim-Jewish relations were normal, everyday experience. There was nothing exceptional about it. And Iraq had a long tradition of religious tolerance. In Iraq, the Jews were one minority among many. There are many other minorities. And by and large, they got on okay. Iraq did not have a Jewish problem, in inverted commas. Europe had a Jewish problem. In Iraq, the Jews didn't live in ghettos. They lived everywhere, and there were Jews of all classes. There was a large number of poor working class Jews. There was a solid middle class. My own family was rather privileged. We were upper class, wealthy, upper class, well-off Jewish family. But all of us were Iraqis, and King Faisal I of Iraq, who had the job of forging one nation from all these different communities, Sunnis, Shi'is, Christians, Turkomans, Assyrians, and so on. He had the job of merging, of unifying the population. He used to say, we are all Iraqis. I am a Muslim, Sunni Muslim, so-and-so is a Christian. It didn't matter. What mattered is that we were all Iraqis. This was the homeland. And the Jews were a very positive element in the making of, in nation building, in the making of our modern Iraq. They contributed at every level, the economic, the financial, the political, the literary, journalism. The Jews were a very positive force in Iraqi society. So looking back, I don't see any problem about describing all these Iraqi Jews as Arab Jews.
And you describe a turning point that happened in the years after the creation of the State of Israel in 1948 that ultimately led to your family's displacement and the displacement of over 100,000 Jews from Iraq and many others from other Arab countries. What happened in that period of time that changed this landscape that you described of coexistence into something that became kind of a threat to the Jews that were living in these countries?
What changed was the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. Israel was a Jewish state. The Jews had lived in Iraq since the 6th century BC, 2.5 millennia ago, since the time of the Babylonian exile. But the creation of the State of Israel, for the first time, gave a territorial dimension to Zionism, which it didn't have before. That's the big change, because it was now possible to identify Iraqi Jews as the other. And also, Iraqi Jews, whether they liked it or not, were identified with the Zionist movement. And the great majority were non-Zionist. Iraq was their homeland. They wanted to stay in Iraq. But after Israel was created, the Jews throughout the Middle East were identified with Israel, with the enemy. And 1948 was the first Arab-Israeli war. The Iraqi army fought in Palestine. At the end of the war, after the guns fell silent, all the neighboring Arab states, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, signed armistice agreements with Israel, but the Iraqi army retreated, and the Iraqi government refused to sign an armistice agreement with Israel. So Iraq is still officially at war with Israel. So that's the real turning point, when there was a Jewish state, and any Arab nationalists, and there had been a huge upsurge of Arab nationalism from the 30s onwards. Arab nationalists could say to the Jews in Iraq, you don't belong here, you're outsiders, you belong to the enemy, why don't you go and join your brothers in Palestine? And there were right-wing parties, the Istiqlal Party, the Independence Party, which adopted this policy. They were very hostile to the Jews. They called for the confiscation of the property of the Jews and for the expulsion of the Jews from Iraq. The only party which stood by the Jews after 1948 was the Communist Party, which said, no, the Jews are not outsiders, they are not an enemy, they are part of our society, and they stood by the Jews in Iraq.
And amid this environment that was brewing, this environment of nationalism and mistrust towards Jewish Arabs, there were a series of attacks that you document that took place in other Arab countries, in Egypt, but specifically in Iraq. You document quite extensively what you say is proof that of these attacks, there were a number that were orchestrated not by the Arabs in Iraq, but by Zionist underground militants and people that were trying to create this sense of fear among Jewish communities. What did you uncover through your research?
So after the 1948 war, there was mounting popular hostility towards the Jews in Iraq and the rest of the Arab world. And more importantly, there was persecution by the government of the Jews. This is very important because the government used the Jews as a scapegoat for the Arab defeat in Palestine and a scapegoat for the failure of its own internal policies. So it was very convenient to pick on the Jews and say, they are to blame. And it wasn't just rhetorical. The government pursued official policies of discrimination. Jews were fired from the government service. Restrictions were placed on the activities of Jewish traders and Jewish bankers, and a quota was imposed on the number of Jews who could go to university. And I think that's the main reason for the Jewish exodus from Iraq. But it wasn't the only reason. Another reason was that 5 bombs exploded in Jewish sites between 1950 and 1951. In March 1950, the Iraqi government passed a law which said any Jew who wants to leave the country is free to do so. They have a year to register. And initially, very few Jews opted to up sticks and go and live in Israel. But the situation deteriorated, and the series of bombs created a panic and a sense of uncertainty which led more and more Jews to register to leave the country. I was always interested in the question of the bombs because in Israel there were persistent rumors that Israel had a hand in the bombings, and Iraqi Jews were convinced that Israel had a hand in uprooting them, and they were very resentful of that. And I wanted to know whether this is true or not. And when I grew up and I was a historian, I investigated this question. And I didn't want to just repeat conspiracy theories. I wanted to get to the bottom of the matter. And eventually I did. In the course of writing this memoir, I met an elderly friend of my mother's, an Iraqi Jew called Yaakov Karkukli, who had been in the Zionist underground. And he told me a lot about their activities, what they were up to, what they were doing, forging documents, forging passports, paying bribes to officials to facilitate the movement of Jews from Iraq to Israel. And he also told me that one member of his group was called Yosef Basri, a very, very intelligent Jewish lawyer, age 28, who was an ardent Zionist. Basri and his assistant Shalom Saleh Shalom were responsible for 3 out of the 5 bombs. The one bomb was against a bomb exploded in a Jewish cafe, Al-Baida, and I know from an Iraqi source that the perpetrator was a young activist in the Istiklal Party, and this was part of the Istiklal Party's policy of frightening the Jews, accelerating the exodus. Another bomb, the most famous bomb, was a hand grenade that exploded in the Mas'ud Shem Tov synagogue, and there 4 Jews were killed. In all the others, there was damage to property and some injuries, but no one was killed. Here there are 4 fatalities. So this is a famous bomb. And again, Kirkukli told me that Basri was not responsible for that one, but he was responsible for the 3 other bombs. And he told me something else, that Basri's controller was an Israeli intelligence officer named Max Binet, who was based in Tehran. Iran in those days under the Shah had covert relations with Israel. So this intelligence officer could operate from Tehran, and he was the controller of Basri. He guided him. He gave him the TNT. He gave him, and Basri was caught, and his assistant, and they were tried. I believe it was not a show trial, but a fair trial. The evidence was produced. Some of the TNT from one of the sites matched the TNT, traces of TNT in Basri's car. So Basri and his assistant were tried, convicted, sentenced to death, and they were hanged.
And Max Bennett, I believe, was tried in absentia later for a similar case in Egypt.
Yes, that's correct. And this is very important, the link. Max Binet was involved in the Lavon affair. The Lavon affair was named after Pinchas Lavon, the Minister of Defense at the time, and in 1954 there was a Jewish ring of spies and saboteurs under the control of Max Binet, who by this time had moved to Cairo. The purpose of the terrorist attacks of this group, planting bombs in public places, was to create bad blood between the Nasser regime and the West. So it was a false flag operation, like the false flag operations in Iraq in 1951. But one bomb went off prematurely. The whole ring, all the people in the ring were arrested. So was Max Binet, and he committed suicide in prison. And so the importance of, I tell the story of of the Lavon affair in 1954 because I wanted to show that the bombings in Baghdad in 1950-51 were not a one-off thing, that it was part of a pattern of false flag operations, and it was part of what somebody described as cruel Zionism. And this was particularly cruel because it involved innocent Jews, decent Jews, good people, and the Zionist movement or the intelligence officers turned these Jews in Baghdad and then later in Cairo, they turned them into terrorists. They turned them into spies and terrorists against their own homeland. And these people paid the price. Some lost their freedom, some lost their lives, and all of them lost the relationship. They lost their homeland. And moreover, these operations really antagonized Iraqis, non-Jewish Iraqis, and they really turned the Egyptian society against the Jews in general because of these false flag operations.
And what do you think was the aim, the intention behind these attacks, these false flag operations? What was the Israeli intelligence and the Zionist movement trying to achieve, and why would it go to such drastic lengths to do it?
In 1954, Britain, which had occupied the Suez Canal zone, had reached an agreement to vacate the canal zone, take out all its soldiers and terminate its bases there. This was a sore point for Egyptian nationalists, the presence of an imperial power on their land. And Gamal Abdel Nasser was the leader of radical Arab nationalism and strongly anti-imperialist. So he wanted the British out, and in 1954 an agreement was reached between Britain and Egypt about the British withdrawal. And the Israelis didn't like this agreement. So the purpose of the terrorist attacks was to signal to Britain and to America and to the West that the Nasser regime was not reliable, that it is not safe, and therefore they shouldn't withdraw. They should maintain their presence and keep and control over the military regime in Egypt. That was the purpose. It was very, very short-sighted, and it backfired disastrously, with serious consequences for the Jewish community in Egypt.
And as you described, the real victims of these policies were the hundreds of thousands of Jewish Arabs that were then forcibly displaced from their homes and had to flee to Israel. Your family was one of them. You yourself were 5 years old when you made the move to Israel. What was that life like for the people that arrived there, specifically the Arab Jews that arrived to Israel, many of whom you described didn't necessarily believe in the idea of Zionism?
My family was not typical. We were upper middle class, wealthy Jews, and my mother had a British passport, so we were spared the reception that awaited more than 100,000 Iraqi Jews. When they arrived in Israel en masse in 1951, Israel was still recovering from the war of 1948. Resources were limited. There was immigration from Eastern Europe. There were Holocaust survivors. It wasn't an easy time for Israel to absorb mass immigration. Having said that, the Iraqi Jews arrived with great expectations to the promised land. And I forgot to say that not all of them were reluctant to move to Israel. There was always a group of religious Jews who aspired, who responded to the lure of Zion, who wanted to go there for religious reasons. But anyway, the whole group who arrived in Israel en masse were in for a shock, because at the airport they were sprayed with DDT, which is something you spray animals with DDT, infesticide. So that was a horrible shock and quite traumatic. And then they were taken to Ma'abarot, to transit camps, and they lived in tents, and the food was very poor quality. The sanitary conditions were very, very poor, very elementary, very basic. And some of the transit camps were surrounded by barbed wire, and this evoked terrible memories, associations in the mind of Jews. And one last point is that the managers of the transit camps were Ashkenazi Jews. They didn't know anything about what happened, who these people were who arrived. From Iraq, the whole community came with its leaders, with its professionals, with doctors and lawyers, and they were treated as if they came from a backward country, from a primitive country. And also, there was a sense that Israel was being really noble and generous to rescue them from anti-Semitism in the Arab world, and they should be very grateful for what they were getting. So it wasn't a very good beginning for the 125,000 Jews from Iraq who arrived suddenly in Israel.
Make a distinction in the book between the Ashkenazi Jews, the ones who migrated from Europe, and the Mizrahi Jews, such as yourself, that came from the Middle East. What was that distinction like for you growing up in Israel? Did you feel like there was a difference, there was a preferential difference?
I felt the difference very acutely as a young boy in Israel. First, there was the linguistic problem. I only knew Arabic. We only spoke Arabic at home, and we arrived in Israel, so I had to learn Arabic. I had to learn Hebrew. I went to kindergarten and then to school. And my mother says that for a year I hardly spoke at all, and they were very worried about me. It's only when I was able to speak Hebrew that I started speaking again. And this is a problem that all new immigrants had. It was much more difficult to learn Hebrew for the older generation than for kids like my sisters and myself. My father, who was 50 years old when we arrived, never really learned to speak Hebrew properly. But beyond the linguistic problem of adjustment, there was there was a feeling, I felt it, that everything Ashkenazi was superior. It's an advanced modern society. Israel was part of the free world, and everything Arab was backward and primitive. There was a sense that Arabic was a very ugly and primitive language. I'm not saying that I encountered direct discrimination. No one said to me, "You're an Iraqi," it was a subjective feeling that I had, that the rest of society looked down on me and on other kids from the Arab countries because we came from Arab countries. And also, the Arabs were the enemy, and we were not. We were somewhere in between. We had come from an Arab country, but we were still Arabs in some sense. I was very impressed with what I saw around me, a country that is being built up from the ground up, a lot of activity, construction, and so on. But I felt that Israel is an Ashkenazi trick, and I wasn't part of this trick, and I didn't fully understand it. So I did feel that I didn't belong. And Edward Said called his autobiography, which is also about his early life, he called it Out of Place. He never felt that he belonged. And that was also my feeling in Israel, that I didn't really belong there. And I had a sense of inferiority because I was an Iraqi, which defined my relationship with Israeli society. It's only after I left Israel many years later that I got over this sense of inferiority.
And I think part of your experience in the IDF as well you helped bolster the way you describe, your sense of nationalism towards Israel. At what point in time did you start to question this identity again and reach the place where you are now, which, you're very critical of both Israel and Zionism as an ideology? What was it that changed your perception of it?
It was a very gradual process of disenchantment with Israel, but I would say that the turning point was the June 1967 war, because I did military service in the Israeli army, in the IDF, between 1964 and 1966, and I was an ardent nationalist. I was a patriot. I really believed in the justice of our cause. I believed that we were a small, peace-loving country surrounded by hostile and predatory Arabs who wanted to throw us into the sea. I still remember the initiation ceremony in the Israeli army on the Judean hills in the twilight, and we all shouted in unison, "By blood and fire Judea fell. By blood and fire Judea will rise again." And we swore loyalty to the homeland. And there was fusillade of firing squad which illuminated the sky. It was a very, very moving experience, heady experience for a boy of 18. And as an academic, I read a lot about nationalism. There is a extensive literature on nationalism. But at that time, I felt nationalism in my bones. So I was a true Israeli nationalist. But after the victory in the June 1967 war, Israel trebled its territory. It captured the Golan Heights, the West Bank, the Sinai Peninsula, and Israel became overtly a colonial power. That's when, and then Israel started building settlements on occupied Palestinian territory in violation of international law. And it's continued to build settlements and expand settlements illegally today. So that's when the disenchantment began, and it was a slow process. And what I felt particularly is that the army had changed, because I served proudly and loyally in the IDF when it was true to its name. It was the Israel Defense Forces. But after June 1967, the character of the army changed. It became the brutal police force of a brutal colonial power. And the main task of the army since then has been, well, not the main task. The main task remained to defend Israel against regular armies of the Arab states. But a new task was to police the occupation in the Palestinian territories. And that completely changed the character of the army. So I could no longer identify with that army. And today it's become really a settlers' army. The IDF in the West Bank doesn't do anything to protect the Arabs. It does everything. It only protects the settlers, and when the settlers go on the rampage and there is really disturbing, alarming escalation of settler violence against Palestinians, the army does nothing to curb them. On the contrary, it supports them. So today my disenchantment with Israel has reached a new climax.
And if we look at the situation today, and as we're speaking, there are mass protests across Israeli cities against legislation that essentially overturns the power of the judiciary in Israel and gives the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his far-right government almost untapped authority in the country. How do you read what is happening today? There's a lot of people that are saying that this is the end of the democratic state of Israel, that this is a turning point. From your perspective as an Israeli, as a historian, how do you read it?
In historical perspective, this is the most serious constitutional crisis that Israel has ever faced. What is at stake is Israeli democracy and everything that goes with it, which is the rule of law, the independence of the judiciary. So this is a frontal attack on Israeli democracy and on the main symbol of Israeli democracy, which is the Supreme Court. And I know that the Supreme Court is no friend of the Palestinians. The Supreme Court has been quite conservative and rubber-stamped a lot of policies that are apartheid policies, discriminatory policies, policies of ethnic cleansing. So it's not a paragon of virtue in my eyes. It has its limitations, and yet it enjoys independence. And now there is an attempt to cut the powers of the Supreme Court because now it is able to rule policies of the government as illegal, but now the government would be able to act in complete freedom and complete impunity, and the Supreme Court would not be able to intervene and restrain it. So this is really serious. And there have been impressive protests by not thousands, but hundreds of thousands of Israelis for the last 29 weeks. So Israelis sense what is at stake, what the government is trying to do, which is to undermine democracy. And it's not just protesters in the streets, it's also the reservists, the pilots who serve in the reserve, who said if the law goes through, then they are not going to report to reserve duty. That's completely unprecedented. But having said all that, I'm still worried about the state of Israel today and the direction it is going, because this right-wing government with extreme right-wing xenophobes in it, like Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, they have a right-wing agenda, an ethno-nationalist agenda. They are proponents of Jewish supremacy. They say that the whole of the West Bank is part of the land of Israel. The real aim is ethnic cleansing and annexation of the West Bank. But they can't declare that openly, so they're moving stage by stage. One way of paving the way is by neutralizing the judiciary. Smotrich is Minister of Finance, but he's also in charge of the civil administration on the West Bank. So he controls what the police does on the West Bank. And this government has been extremely aggressive in its treatment of the Palestinians on the West Bank. And in the protests, very little is said about the government's oppression of the Palestinians. It's all about the defense of Jewish democracy and Jewish rights. And that's where, although I welcome the protest, I also see who is involved in the protest. It's the opposition, the center parties, the party of Lapid and Gantz, the centrist parties. But these parties are proponents of liberal ethnocentrism. So they are not as extreme. They want to maintain the appearances, a facade of a liberal democracy, which Israel is not. Israel is an apartheid state. And these centrist parties don't have an alternative to the policy of the government, because they support the occupation, they support all the settlements staying in place, they support Jerusalem remaining, to use the slogan, the eternal undivided capital of Israel. So they have a nationalist agenda. They have nothing to offer as an alternative. So it's a struggle now between right-wing ethno-nationalism and liberal ethno-nationalism, and I don't approve of either. I think that I believe in democracy. An essential element of democracy is equal rights. I believe in equal rights. I used to support a two-state solution, but Israel has killed the two-state solution with the settlements. So today I support one democratic state from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, with equal rights for all its citizens, regardless of religion and ethnicity. In other words, I totally reject Israel as a Jewish supremacy state, and I would like it to be a democratic, pluralist state. And here, the experience that my family and I had of living together, coexisting with Arabs, give me reason for hope that what happened once in the Middle East can happen again, or at least this is the goal to which I aspire.
And one of the things that I was sharing with you just before was that reading this book and reading your experiences, your parents' experiences, even some of the conversations that you had with your mother, who is very present and is a very lively character in this story, reminded me of a lot of the Iraqis that I grew up with. It feels very much an Arab story full of Arab characters. And when you look at the situation today, and when you look at figures such as Itmar Ben-Gvir, who you mentioned, who himself comes from Iraqi origin, there's a real sense of ethnocentrism, as you mentioned, but this idea, this antagonism towards not only Palestinians, but the Arab identity itself within Israeli borders. When you think about this future that you propose that is centered around Arab Jews such as yourself building this kind of bridge, is this identity lost now in Israel? Does it need to be revived? And how can it be this joining force that allows two different people that are at the furthest they've ever been from each other to talk to one another again and build something new?
I'd always hoped that the Arab Jews who had lived in the Arab world, who spoke Arabic, would serve as a bridge between Israel and its neighbors. But that hasn't happened. The Arab Jews were marginalized in Israel. The elite was always an Ashkenazi elite, and the policies of Israel under both Labour and Likud have been very nationalist policies of mobilizing society against the enemy. So the hope that Oriental Jews would serve as a bridge has not materialized. And another thing about Israeli politics is that many of the immigrants from the Arab countries have voted for the parties of the right and for the Likud. The Likud wouldn't have come to power had it not had a considerable Mizrahi constituency. And this is still the case today, that a lot of the Jews who hail from Arab countries support either the religious parties or the Likud or the parties of the more extreme right. One example of that is Itamar Ben-Gvir. So that's the direction in Israel, in which Israel is going, moving further to the right, and also there is an increasing number of religious Jews. The Haredi Jews are about 13%, but the number of religious Jews in general is more like 30%, and they have a higher birth rate. So I'm not at all hopeful about the direction in which Israel is moving. The issue that concerns me most is the occupation, that Israel is an apartheid state, and I can't see any change coming from within. I can't see anything inside Israeli society, any impulse to reverse the occupation. So as far as the occupation is concerned, the only hope is pressure from outside on Israel. And sadly, at the moment, there is neither any impulse to end the occupation from within, quite the contrary, and the Western governments are all pro-Israeli and give the Israeli government a free pass. So that's the situation today, and but I don't give up hope that it will change and that we would have a return to pluralism and cosmopolitanism and coexistence. And I don't give up hope that Israel's behavior will change for the better in the long run, not in the short run, but in the long run. Because like Abba Eban, I believe that nations can act rationally after they'd exhausted all the other alternatives.
Professor Avi Shlaim, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for your time today, and thank you for being with us.
It's been a real pleasure for me to be here and to talk to you and to your listeners. Thank you.
Thank you for watching this episode of The Big Picture. Thank you to Professor Avi Shlaim for being our guest for today. This is a fascinating story, and one that I hope gets a lot of attention from his book, from his writings, but also in our current world today. Please leave your comments below about what you thought about this episode, and let us know who you'd like to interview next. As always, you can subscribe and listen to all of our podcasts in audio format wherever you get your podcasts from. And until next time, salam.